In South Carolina, there are about 383,000 veterans. There were 134 veteran suicides, according to the VA, in 2022. 134 is a tragic number, but we should be careful to recognize that's not a number that's exorbitant. I'm not talking tens of thousands. Suicide is often tragically an impulsive act. Somebody gets into a down space, they say, I'm going to kill myself, and they have the means to do it. And then you have an intersection between means and intent, and that results in a tragedy. We know that if you can separate lethal means from intent, even for a short period of time, you'll have a reduction in actualized suicides, because suicide is often tragically an impulsive act. Somebody gets into a down space, they say, I'm going to kill myself, and they have the means to do it. And then you have an intersection between means and intent, and that results in a tragedy. So if we can do things like encourage veterans and others to lock up their weapons, lock up their ammunition, separate that by time and space, even for a minute, we know that results in less suicides.
Hey, let's welcome Todd McCaffrey, South Carolina Secretary of Veterans Affairs and a retired Major General in the U.S. Army. Welcome to the show, sir, and good to see you.
Hey, Danny, thanks very much. It's great to be here with today.
Yeah, absolutely. Same on my end. So let's start with your story. Why did you decide to join the Army? How you rose through the ranks? And what happened after you retired as a two-star general?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I growing up as a kid, I actually wanted to always go in the Navy. I wanted to go to the Naval Academy. I thought I'd be a naval aviator. My father had been in the Navy. So I tried to get in the Naval Academy a couple of years in a row and was never successful. Someone suggested I should apply to West Point. I did. Then actually I got into West Point instead of the Naval Academy. And so that's the way I kind of found my way into the Army. I spent my career as an infantry officer, which was, I was looking for a challenge when I was, 21, 22, 23 years old. I thought the infantry was that kind of challenge. Spent much of my career in light infantry units and air assault units and finally in striker units. And I stayed in the Army because I enjoyed the challenge. I really like being around soldiers. Soldiers will keep you young at the end of the day, 18, 19, 20-year-olds at the time would keep you. And of course, when my wife and I married, we started having children. And, the reality also is that the military is a really good job for a family in the sense that you've got good health care and it stays with you. And so, I woke up after 20 years and I was still in and loved it. And I was fortunate enough kind of later in my career to, command at the right levels, commanded battalion, a brigade in combat, and then was blessed to become a general officer. And at that point, you're kind of given back to the institution at the strategic level. I did that for a number of years and retired out of the Army in 2020. And after woke up and said, man, it was 34 years I was in uniform. It seems like a very long time.
Yeah, and since we're going to talk about veterans in a few minutes, you're a great example of that. Do you want to share your transition story and how you managed to adapt to the civilian life back, out of the uniform? What were some challenges that you faced and how you managed those?
It's a great question. I'll be honest with you. So, when I retired from the Army, I was stationed in Germany and I was coming back and I was recruited for a job by an old boss to come back to here to South Carolina and take a job at the University of South Carolina. And I did that. One, it was a good job, but second, I had great loyalty for my old boss, who was the president of the university, and I wanted to come back and work with him. So I kind of jumped into that without thinking through the process well. And I'll be honest, the transition for me was hard, and just like it is, I think, for any transition service member. And what was so hard about it, I'd spent my entire adult life from 4 years at West Point to 34 years in the Army in uniform. And all of a sudden, it's like having the rug pulled out from underneath you in terms of your, the camaraderie, your sense of purpose, the community. And I felt in some ways I kind of landed on Mars. I was in this civilian world all of a sudden in a place I had never been. I had never lived in South Carolina. So it was hard. And I'll be honest, I think it took me probably a couple years of decompression in some ways to kind of get over that I was no longer in the Army. The Army used the term soldier for life. And it took me a while to embrace that, to recognize it. Just because I've left active duty doesn't mean I haven't left the principles of the Army. But that took a couple of years to kind of work my way into that, I think. And I think a lot of veterans go through that transition process when you serve for 3 years or 30 years. And I'll be honest, structurally, the transition process structurally between, the Department of Defense and the federal side and moving to is hard. I didn't know, for example, I had no idea that there were resources at the state and county level for transition services. It just wasn't on my radar screen. I knew about the VA. It's kind of ironic because I'm running the state Department of Veterans Affairs, but I didn't even know it existed when I transitioned 5 years ago. And if that happens to a retired 2-star, you can obviously kind of, see what that's gonna be like for a staff sergeant who's getting out after 5 or 6 or 7 years. Yeah, that's a tough piece. And I think transition is always challenged for veterans. And one last thing I'll make, kind of comment. There's a lot of talk about how veterans, fall off the cliff when they transition. I would think part of the reason for that is there's not a warm handoff between leaving the Department of Defense or in the case of the Coast Guard, Homeland Security, and then your civilian life. This bridge between the two sometimes has got a gap. People who are successful kind of manage that gap well, but some don't. And I think that leads someone to kind of start downward places. Fortunately, it's not a lot comparative to the number that transitioned, but it is a real issue. So it was challenging for me. I've been retired for 5 years, and I think I finally embraced my role now as a retired Army officer. Haven't left behind the values of the service, but have embraced the opportunities that exist and the flexibility that exists now as a civilian.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, and I've heard it from, I've interviewed many veterans, from people like you, general officers, to NCOs, and like everyone in between. And not everyone understands all of the benefits, and not everyone, takes advantage of the resources that they might have access to, whether it comes from the government or from other organizations. But I'm curious, with your unique perspective, what do you think regular civilians or maybe family members of those who are transitioning out, or who are already veterans who already spend some time out of the uniform, what can we do to help veterans adapt to this life, to support them, and to make their life out of the uniform more comfortable?
Yeah, no, that's a great question as well. I think the first thing is to recognize that it's really important, I think, for veterans, and I'd say veterans are really kind of referring to transitioning service members who are about to become veterans. It's really important to understand that, first of all, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the federal VA ought to be your foundation. File for your disability benefits, file for veterans health care. Those things are important because they are foundational. You may not, for example, you may choose not to use VA healthcare as your healthcare solution when you transition. That's fine, but it's nice to have it there as a backup if you need it in the future. And so I always say start with the VA as a foundational piece, and then layer onto that the other services that might be of value to meet the gaps in your particular life. If you're a transition service member who's really, beginning to feel missing the camaraderie of having served in the Marine Corps, for example, or the Air Force, you can reach out to groups that kind of allow you to build in. And I speak for South Carolina, but most other states have this. There's a mechanism in many cases to outreach to these services, largely in the nonprofit community, quite frankly, that provide these opportunities for veterans to retain the areas that they want. Not all veterans need camaraderie. Some need job skills, retraining and upskilling kind of issues. The VA can help with that, but so can the private sector, the nonprofit sector. So the advice I give to family members and others: make sure your transition service member is started with the. Make sure, ask the question: have you filed for your disability? Have you enrolled in VA healthcare? And surprisingly, many don't, and I think largely this is a problem. Largely, if you're getting out of the military, particularly as a junior enlisted or mid-grade enlisted service member, they often, when they're getting down to the taps with the transition assistance program, they just want to get out. They're like, hey man, let me turn my stuff into CIF and let me get the heck out of here. And so they don't invest the mental energy you need to think their way through that process. And the next thing they're out and have lost that opportunity. So what I tell folks is encourage your transition service member, whether you're a parent, a spouse, a sibling, to get enrolled in VA first and work your way through that process, and then layer on top of it the services you need based on the locality you're at.
Yeah, I appreciate this. And before we move on into how veterans can help and their unique skills, I still want to address this question, because I have so many veteran friends who are talking about this issue of, unfortunately, some tragic events, and veterans take their own lives. There are some statistics, and I don't have the exact numbers, but there is this issue. And what do you think we can do to support veterans to prevent things like that? Maybe it's through employment, or as you said, through healthcare, or anything else that can help save lives of those who saved ours.
Yeah. Hey, Danny, it's an important and a tragic topic, but I also think it's important to recognize how it fits in the broader piece. I'll give you an example. Use South Carolina statistics, and this is U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs numbers. As you know, the annual report on suicide for the VA comes out every year, but it's 2 years lag. So the data that came out in 2024 is for 2022. So in South Carolina, there are about 383,000 veterans. There were 134 veteran suicides according to the VA in 2022. 134 is a tragic number, but we should be careful to recognize that's not a number that's exorbitant. I'm not talking tens of thousands. One is too many, but it is important to recognize, number one, this is a tragic step for a relatively small number. The rate number the VA puts out was about 17.5 veterans per day is what they quoted in 2022. It's a little less than 22 veterans a day. You kind of hear about kind of in the conventional wisdom. The point being is it's a tragic problem, but it's a problem that's isolated to a relatively small number. Now, having said that, it's a really wicked problem set because the problem with suicide is it's really hard to prove a negative. You don't know, if I do this, will it result in suicide rates coming down? The research is really challenging this. And I'll tell you, the one thing we know works, and this is where I tell and work encourages in South Carolina. We have a program here called Lock It South Carolina. We know that if you can separate lethal means from intent, even for a short period of time, you'll have a reduction in actualized suicides because suicide is often tragically an impulsive act. Somebody gets in a down space, they say, I'm going to kill myself, and they have the means to do it. And then you have an intersection between means and intent, and that results in a tragedy. So if we can do things like encourage veterans and others to lock up their weapons, lock up their ammunition, separate that by time and space, even for a minute, we know that results in less suicides. But those kind of things are helpful. And then, of course, we have to invest in the mechanisms to help veterans get the care they need. The reality is, and the research shows us, a lot of suicides are not non-mental health problems. We spend a lot of time talking about mental health, and that's an important topic. But it's also to recognize that a lot of veterans and non-veterans who kill themselves is not because they had a mental health disorder. They've got, they're running into life challenges. They have lack of, in many cases, the inability to have the resilience to cope with those things. And I think there's a lot to be said about how we build resilience and coping skills, both in the military and in transition service members. That's harder in a world where they're surrounded by social media and all the kind of things that comes in that gives them all sorts of, stimulus and echo chambers and those kind of things. But the reality is that probably the most basic thing we do to help get after this is encourage people to do things like separate lethal means. Lock up your guns, man. Just lock them up. And that'll build time and space, and then you'll have less suicides. And then we can have a conversation about, the other things that wrap the way around it. I'll get off my soapboxes, but I do want to say there's one thing. And I spent a lot of time at the state level talking about this. We spent a lot of time on suicide prevention talking about what I describe as input metrics. I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to have this talk group. I'm going to do these kind of things. But we never map it to whether it's having an impact on output measures, which is actually suicides. And it's a really hard piece. That has to do with hard data review in terms of understanding, if I do this, did I see a downward trend? And that's correlation, not causation. And it's really hard. And I think too often, particularly on social media, the buzz gets, we feel good about, the ice bucket challenge for ALS, or we feel good about 22 push-ups a day for veterans. But the fact of the matter is that having an impact on reducing suicides? And in most cases, I would offer probably not. It's good for getting awareness. But I think we need to spend more time about things that we know work. And one of the things we know works is locking your damn weapons up. And that's a good thing to separate means from intent. So yeah, it's a difficult problem set. We got to keep it in context. And then we got to look really hard at the things we know work and spend more time thinking about how do we draw connections to correlation, if not causation, between actions and outputs. And outputs, unfortunately, have to do with actualized suicides.
Great, thank you for sharing this great insights. And as we talked about offline, there is a whole other side of this whole veterans issue, which is much more positive, where veterans can contribute to the workforce through their leadership skills and through all of the any kinds of skills that they've gained over the years in the military. But also, as you said, it's not easy to find that camaraderie again, and not everyone feels like they're in that space where they used to be. So what's your perspective on veterans' impact on private sector, and what employers or people who hire them should know about veterans to profit for the company, but also to help veterans to find jobs and contribute?
Hey, it's a great time. I was just in Charleston, South Carolina the other day at a veteran employment fest with the lieutenant governor and my counterpart from the Department of Employment and Workforce. We were talking to veteran employers. I will tell you, employers get this already. They want veterans to come work for them. I mean, this is sometimes we gotta remind the veteran you're in a buyer's market in some areas. You got to have some flexibility where you're going to live, those kind of things. But the reality is, employers figured this out a long time ago, because veterans bring three things to the workforce that is great raw material. Transitioning service members are disciplined because of the military service. They know how to work on a team, and they've demonstrated the ability of being trained on skills they did not have before they entered the military. And I don't care whether you're running a body shop, an auto body shop, or whether you're building F-16 fighters, or whether you're producing clothing. The fact of the matter is, you want employees who have demonstrated discipline, who are team oriented, and can be trained. And that's great raw material for veterans, which is why I think veteran unemployment lags the national average. Our unemployment is lower than the average citizen. We know veterans vote at a higher rate. We know veterans give to charity at a higher rate. We know that veterans in academic settings perform better than non-veterans. So the fact of the matter is, there's tons of data out there that shows that veterans contribute more than they consume after they transition. Sometimes we just have to convince the veteran that they're in that market. Sometimes it's not the employers, it's the veteran, who I think sometimes veterans recognize their own potential. And then, just be fair, a veteran's got to have some flexibility. If you make the decision, hey man, I'm going home to, I'll use rural South Carolina. I'm going home to some small town of rural South Carolina. That's just where I'm going to go. You maybe challenge finding employment there, because that's not where the employers are. But if you're willing to go to a place where there's active employment, and I'll put a plug in for my state. Our state's growing leaps and bounds in manufacturing and research and other things. And there are jobs there for veterans, but you got to be willing to do the same things that you did in the military. You've got to be willing to offer yourself up for additional training or new training, reskilling, take advantage of VA benefits. In many cases, that's a great opportunity for reskilling, take advantage of VA programs on those. And in many cases, you'll find states, my state's one of them, where there's all sorts of programs in the tech college system that are giving veterans the ability of upskilling or reskilling to get employment. So I'm bullish on veteran employment, because I watch it all the time, and I hear from employers all the time who are saying, "Man, where can I track down more veterans?" Because they bring in, they show up on, it's basic stuff. They show up and work on time. They understand I'm supposed to report formation 07. They're there at at 6:55. They know how to work on a team. They're not swimming upstream with against other guys. They're used to that process. And man, no one joined the Army knowing how to drive a tank. No one joined, the Air Force knowing how to hang a bomb on an aircraft. Those were skills you learn once you got into the service. The military does a great job of training them, but industry does too. And industry is looking to reduce costs, and the way they reduce costs is, if I can upskill this guy or gal quickly, I reduce my costs. That immediately results in a profit, or reduce costs for the industries. Yeah, listen, veteran employment is a huge deal, and it's I'm going to use my state. We are about 100,000 vacant positions in South Carolina, and there ain't 100,000 veterans to fill those jobs. But I want to tell you what, the ones that come here, employers are looking for them, because they are quote money for sure for firms.
Yeah, that's great to hear all of these statistics. Very inspiring. Mentorship is a huge part of a career of any service member. But then I'm curious, you, and maybe if we take you as an example, once you've started to transitioning out of the military, did you have mentors, maybe other veterans or someone in the civilian sector, who helped you transition out, or you had to do it on your own? And maybe we need more mentors who help transitioning service members go through this process smoother.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I think first issue, I think all people who transition, we tend to focus kind of on our networks, if you will. They're kind of tied to where our own tribe. So when I transitioned out of the Army after 34 years, my network and my mentors, of course, were really folks who I serve with in the military. And in my case, they tend to be, officers who've been more senior to me, who I work for, who still view as mentors. And they helped. But over time, what you find is your network expands and you broaden that a bit. And I've been able to find after some time, kind of now in the civilian sector, a greater appreciation for what some of these folks who never served in the military, what they've done in their business careers. And they provide a whole new perspective. So when I kind of view mentorship for a transition service member or somebody who's leaving the military is it's a bit of an evolving journey. You may start off with a mentoring kind of piece, someone who's, was in the service with you or a more senior NCO or an officer, for example. But as you get kind of more time and space between your departure from military service and your time outside of that, very often I think that those mentoring roles shift to folks in the industry or the sector which you're in. Um, and as you know, mentoring is a two-way street. I can't impose myself as a mentor upon you. You have to accept my willingness to be a mentor. And at the same time, a mentee has got to be willing to seek out a mentor. And I think sometimes for some of us in the military, we all want to be self-reliant and self-sufficient, and and occasionally seeking out a mentor can appear as being a vulnerability. I'm going to expose myself for my weaknesses to someone. And that's a mental hurdle you got to get over because it's because people want to help. I'm truly of the belief that folks want people to succeed in general. And I tell you, I know for a fact people want veterans to succeed because they think highly of the fact that they made the decision to serve to begin with. So this is an interesting piece. Mentoring, I think, starts off in this kind of narrow post-service kind of piece, but then over time expands. And I think the part of the mentee, the service member's transition, it's got to be, I'm willing to accept a mentor. I'm willing to seek one out. And then, of course, we need to, for those that's been out for a while, we need to offer ourselves up for those who, and recognize, and I think this is all, you got to evolve your transition process. I retired as a two-star general. You got to check the rank at the door sometimes. I mean, at the end of the day, we got to realize that culture is different as the civilian world. And the longer you spend in the military, the more you're steeped in this issue of hierarchy and rank and uniform. That's a different cultural norm that's on the outside. And it takes some time for people to get over it. It took me time to get over it. And it certainly takes time for the people who used to work for me to get over it, try to say, hey, we're at a different stage of life now, and which is also part of the calculus, and that's cultural. And I think at the end of the day, mentorship can be steeped in culture as well. So it takes some time, which is why transition is a journey, not a point in time.
Hmm. And talking about your current position as the Secretary of South Carolina's Veterans Affairs, what do you want to share with listeners from your state, and maybe to better understand how this works? Does every state have the um, such an organization on a state level, or is it something unique to South Carolina? Because as you said, not everyone knows about these like state level, county level institutions. So if you can speak to that a little.
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, every state does have a state office. It may not be a secretary, it may be a commissioner, or maybe a director of effects, but every state has, all 54 states and territories, as a matter of fact, have some level of veteran services within state government. So that's an important piece to recognize. What occurs at the more local level, the county or the municipal level, may vary by state a little bit. In South Carolina, we have 46 county Veterans Affairs offices. They don't work for me, though. They work for the county. We collaborate with them, but they're not under my supervision. That's different in other states where they work directly for the state. So I think the first thing to recognize that there is an architecture and apparatus within every state, and that they often run parallels to the veteran service organizations that you've heard about, the traditional ones, of course, the American Legion, the VFW, the DAV, et cetera. But then there's all sorts of newer ones around, like Team RWB, Wounded Warrior Project, and others that are out there operating that space as well. So I tell veterans, first of all, it's good up to you, kind of get on Google and Google your state Veterans Affairs office, and that'll lead you to what the state has, whether it's a commission or in my case, a department, or even an office within another agency. That's a great way to start to understand that and outreach. That can lead you on the mechanism down. We got to do a better job on TAP. Honestly, we got to do a better job of helping service members that depart recognize what's available, particularly if they're not going to stay in the state where they're transitioning. So if somebody's getting out of the Army at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, but they're going home to Washington State, we got to do a better job in helping them understand what Washington State can do. The same way that Washington State at Joint Base Lewis McChord has got to be able to help folks recognize that they're coming home or going to South Carolina. That's something we're all of my counterparts and I are working on to try to do that. But forums like this is helpful because it gets the word out on these things. But it is an important point for transition service. Recognize there is help. And I tell folks in South Carolina, yeah, I just offer there's three types of transition service members. There's the guy or the gal who's getting out of the military and they're going to stay where they're put. I'm getting out of the military at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I'm staying in North Carolina. There's the one who says, I'm getting out of the Marine Corps at Camp Lejeune. I'm going home to Pennsylvania. And then there's what I describe as the undecided voter. I'm going to go where I get the best job or the best deal I can for myself and my family. And we're all in competition for that undecided voter because we want them to transition here. So if you're getting out of the Army at Fort Drum, New York, we want you to come to South Carolina. Now, New York wants you to stay. We want you to come here. So it goes back to my point that in many cases, the transition service member is a bit of a buyer's market because people are competing for that talent and that potential for their states and their industries.
And we have just a few minutes left, but if you want to use this time to either share a message, something that you haven't had a chance to talk about, or maybe emphasize something that we've already covered, please use these few minutes to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Here's what I would offer is, there was a time in our nation's history, just not so long ago, 20, 30, 40, certainly 50 years ago, where you couldn't throw a dead cat without hitting a veteran. I mean, veterans are ubiquitous in society because everybody served. As the military has gotten smaller over the years, of course, that number is declining and declining. The veteran population nationally declines by about 1.6% per year nationally. It's getting smaller because the military has gotten smaller and older veterans are aging out. So first of all, I think we have to recognize that many Americans who did not serve or haven't had people in their families who served directly get their perspective on veterans through what they hear about veterans. So if they hear about post-traumatic stress, they're going to think post-traumatic stress. If they hear about homelessness, and again, those are real issues for a segment of the veteran community. But we also got to recognize there are so many veterans out there who are not afflicted with those issues, who are doing amazing work by leading their communities, leading their industries, et cetera. And we've got to let Americans understand that military service doesn't result in bad outcomes. It will on occasion, but the fact is, military service is a good thing. And we want to encourage young people to consider military service as an option, whether it's for 3 years or 30. It's good for our nation. And I firmly believe, as a veteran and a father of a veteran, it's good for individuals as well. So I guess what a message I would leave for people is, recognize military service. Becoming a veteran is a good thing. It'll help you personally. It helps the nation. It helps our communities. And we are better for having people who've made the decision to spend time in uniform. So I appreciate the opportunity to highlight that because I think it's an important message for folks to understand.
Yeah, and thank you, Todd, for sharing all of these insights and your unique, again, perspective on all of these issues. Truly appreciate your time today, and thank you for your service and for what you're doing now to help veterans. And great show today, and thank you again for joining.
Hey, Danny, thanks so much for the opportunity. I appreciate you taking the time to spread the message.
Sure.